Okay, good afternoon. Today, moving along with actually continuing our discussion on monetary policy, but expanding it further. It's chapter 15. Sorry, your book. And essentially, what it is about is an attempt to clarify why Keynesians believe that monetary policy doesn't work or is not likely to work, and why monetarists believe that monetary policy works. So that's the shortest description of what is this all about. Why Keynesians believe monetary policy works, and monetary policy doesn't work. And why monetarists do believe. So we already know that Keynesians believe in fiscal policy, that their preferred tool dealing with situations like a recession or an economic downturn is to increase government spending instead of trying to manipulate money supply. That's fiscal policy. But today we're going to see that they have a certain theory about how monetary policy works. This theory, in their view, according to their arguments, renders the policy ineffective. The monetary policy doesn't work because of the way how monetary policy is structured. To be more precise, because of the mechanisms by which an initial increase in the money supply, which is the usual way how monetary policy is conducted, that you want to prevent a recession or to pull the economy out of recession by using monetary policy, you want to increase the money supply. And you want this increase in money supply to have short-term effects on production of goods and services. Now, the question that you have to ask yourself, the link is this: delta M is a change in money supply. That's what you do as a central bank, as a government. The final goal should be increasing quantity of goods and services that are produced. This is what you do, this is why. Now, the problem, according to Keynesians, is that the transmission mechanisms by which you go from here to there are very complicated, and a lot of things can go wrong. That's the basic idea, that's the gist of the argument, that's the gist of the disagreements between monetarists and Keynesians. Monetarists believe that this link is quite simple and straightforward between a given change in the money supply enacted by the government and the effect in the real economy in the way of higher production. Where Keynesians believe that this link is indirect and complicated, and that a lot of things can go wrong in this transmission of the change in money supply increase in productivity. So what we're going to analyze today is Keynesian view of those transmission mechanisms, Keynesian view of how monetary policy works, essentially. That's transmission mechanisms. So you're not going to learn any new big conclusion about the Keynesianism today. You're not going to learn anything particularly revolutionary that you hadn't known already, but you're going to learn a lot or something about why is that the case, why they believe what they believe, why that they believe that monetary policy is not good. Certainly is not sufficient as a reaction to the session. So this transmission mechanism works, as you will see, in a confluence of three markets that have to interact in order for monetary policy to work. Number one is the money market. The government needs to intervene into the market for money to engineer an increase in money supply. And then this has to influence the interest rate, and through interest rates, to influence the market for investment, market in which people buy and sell machinery, equipment, labor, factors of production, etc. Number two, this is the intermediary step, the market for investment goods. And finally, this is why all the action is taking place, the market for goods and services. So this is the sequence, how monetary policy works. You do something to the money market in order to increase interest rates, to decrease interest rates. Decrease interest rates affect investment, investment affects production. So let's start first with the analysis of money market. What is that? That's a market in which people exchange money, in which private market agents exchange money. And just like any other market, it is determined the price of the good that is being exchanged, monetary unit, given dollar, is determined by the supply and demand. So you have two forces that determine the money market. Demand for money. What is the demand for money? Is a demand for cash balances. It's a demand to hold money. For yourself. That's the demand for money balances. And also you have supply of money. A few words about each one of them. Graphical representation of how demand for money works is very simple. It's a good like any other good. You have a supply, you have price and quantity. Whenever you want to analyze supply and demand, irrespective of which market you're talking about, it's always price and quantity. What is the price of money, interest rate? How much you would charge for parting in a given amount of money, or how much you pay to acquire a unit of money, in here it's quantity of money. So when it comes to demand for money, the relationship is simple. You have this downward sloping demand curve, which tells you that when the market interest rate is higher, quantity of money that will be demanded, like the quantity of money that people would want to hold, will be low. The same inverse relationship as the first law of demand that we already know. Lower the interest rate, quantity of money that people would want to hold is great. Why is that the case? What is this? The simplest explanation for this. The people want to, the people typically, all other things being equal, increase their cash balances when interest rate on the market is high.
Did they put more money in the bank to earn more interest? Did they put more money in the bank to earn more interest?
Yeah, but when interest rate is lower, so that you put more money in the bank, less money in the cash balance. That's the simplest explanation of interest rate. The interest rate incentivizes saving. So remember, the demand for cash balances reduces, the increased demand for cash balances reduces the supply of loans, supply of savings. So here the supply of savings increases. When interest rate is low, the supply of savings will be low. When interest rate increases, the supply of loans will increase. When supply of loans increases, the demand to hold the quantity of money that people want to hold outside of the bank in their cash balances will go down. So there's a direct competing inverse relationship between the amount of money that people want to use for lending. Essentially, you are lending to a bank, your deposit, and the amount of money that they want to hold. So that's the demand for money is determined by interest rates, primarily, whatever they are. And interest rates increase, all other things being equal, the demand for money balances will decline, and vice versa. What determines the supply of money? So we usually think of a supply curve as this upward sloping curve. It varies with the price. This is a regular supply curve here. Interest rate, as the price of money goes up, then the quantity of supply of funds will increase. In the money market, supply of money is independent of interest rates, which means it's fixed. If government doesn't do something with the supply of money, it won't change, irrespective of what happens, irrespective of what happens to the interest rates, it increases or decreases. So it's vertical. This is the supply of money. It's essentially vertical. Only the government can change the supply of money. So why is that the case? Whatever the amount of money, whatever the distribution of money between cash balances and credit, savings money, it's the same amount of money. You can juggle $100 from your left pocket to your right pocket, but the same $100. If you don't earn additional $50, it's completely irrelevant in which pocket you keep. You can do something similar is here. It doesn't matter whether interest rate is low or high. That may influence only how much money people keep in cash balances vis-a-vis how much they keep on savings accounts, for example, in the banks, but it doesn't affect the total quantity of money. Only the government decides, and we now know how governments go about doing this. Open market operations, purchasing government bonds, they can increase the quantity of cash. So in principle, government changes the supply of money with one caveat, with one proviso that if the government decides to change the quantity of money, so it cannot change without government making this decision, but once the government makes this decision, the final quantity of money, the total quantity of money, the total change in the money supply will not be controlled 100% by the government. It will require, or it will depend on the cooperation of private actors. So remember this entire story about how the banking system amplifies the initial purchase of government bonds. Remember that. It's open market operation. The purpose of open market operation is not just to create $1 billion more by buying government bonds. It's to recycle that money to the banking system repeatedly. Remember Johnson Robinson and Smith and Bank A, Bank B, and the money going in circles. And then eventually, depending on the money multiplier, it will be 5, 10, 15 times more money. So you have to keep in mind that proviso. The total change in the money supply will not be controlled. You need the government to put it in motion to start the process of increasing money supply. But how much money supply will increase eventually, it's not completely in the hands of the government. It depends on how banks and individuals react. Okay, so if the government decides to do this, then the supply curve will shift. Right, that's the effect of monetary policy. So this is the equilibrium here. This point, for now, we limit ourselves just to the equilibrium situation. We don't discuss changes in money supply. We just look at the market with a given quantity of money for now. This is the equilibrium interest rate. That's the interest rate at which every dollar that is offered for lending every dollar that is supplied, you will find somebody who will want to keep it in the cash balance. This is the equilibrium quantity of money that is demanded. Supply equals demand. If, for example, supply is greater than demand, here quantity supply greater than quantity demand, the interest rate will have to drop, just as in any other market. When interest rate drops, the supply still remains the same, so the supply is fixed, but the quantity demanded will go up until they equalize. And vice versa, if you have the situation when quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and supply remains the same by definition if the government doesn't do anything, but quantity demanded will automatically go up and we will go back to the equilibrium conditions. So here you have the excess supply of money or surplus of money. Down here you have the shortage, you have the shortage. Okay, so that's a very simple and straightforward description of the money market. So this is the point where the government intervenes. Whenever you conduct monetary policy, you intervene here and then you wait and see what's going to happen in other markets. So you want from money markets to effects to overflow, spill over into the market for investment goods, and eventually market for goods and services. I'm gonna now write a sequence how monetary policy should work ideally, according to Keynesians, and then warn you what are some of the things that can go wrong, and that, according to Keynesians, very often go wrong, rendering monetary policies efficient. So you have delta M money supply. Let's assume that you want to increase the money supply. That's the usual thing that the central banks do. You want to shift money supply to the right. If you shift the money supply to the right, what is going to happen to interest rate? It will have to go up. The same band curve. You shift the supply to the right, you increase the supply, the equilibrium interest rate will put it this way, here maybe more. This is the initial equilibrium. Now you increase the money supply. By increasing money supply, you shift the supply curve to the right. This was your equilibrium interest rate. Originally, the intersection of the supply and demand curves. Now you have a new equilibrium interest rate, much lower one. Down here, at the intersection of the new rightward shifting supply curve and the old. So then delta M, change in money supply, increase in money supply, should lead to a decrease in interest rate. Now the next question, the next point is crucial. A decrease in interest rate should lead to an increase in investment. An increase in investment should lead to an increase in aggregate demand. From this point on, we are talking about goods and services market. This is investment, market for investment goods. This is money market. Interest rate is a connection between, is a link between the money market and investment. aggregate demand should increase when investment increases. If aggregate demand increases, this is important according to Keynesians. An increase in aggregate demand in conditions of recession will lead to an increase in quantity produced. That's what we want to see, while the price level will remain largely stable. Price level remains stable. This is the ideal sequence. Increase the money supply, and increased money supply leads to lower interest rates. Lower interest rates spur greater investment, borrow more money. Commercial borrowers borrow more money. An increase in investment leads to a higher aggregate demand, shifting of the aggregate demand curve to the right, and this leads to an increased productivity, while prices remain relatively stable. Okay, just a few notes of interpretation here, or additional explanation why things work this way, or should work this way. Why delta M increase leads to a drop in interest rate? This picture here shows why an increase in money supply should lead to a drop in interest rate. This is the explanation. Now, why a drop in the interest rate should lead to an increase in investment? That's also very simple. Investment curve of investment demand looks like this. So it varies inversely as well with interest rate. This is investment demand 1, which is lower when the interest rate is higher, and which is higher when the interest rate is lower. It makes basic sense here because commercial borrowers will borrow more money when the costs of borrowing are lower than interest rate is lower. That explains why you move from point 2 to point 3. Now from point 3 to point 4, why an increase in investment should lead to an increase in aggregate demand? Why is that? Remember the formula for the aggregate demand? One of the formulas. Remember that? Consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. So you already know what Keynesians believe should be done with fiscal policy. What is the sequence of events, the sequence of transmission mechanism when you talk about fiscal policy? You increase government spending here for fiscal policy. I'm reminding you of this. Increased government spending leads to increased consumer spending. Why is that? Because people who were unemployed now are employed on infrastructure projects and other type of government programs. They get more money, they increase their consumer spending. By increasing their consumer spending, they increase demand for consumer goods. And in order to produce more consumer goods, firms and companies need more investment. So this increases demand for investment as well. So then the entire GDP increases because first G component, then C component, and I. All three of them increase gradually through fiscal policy. Now, with monetary policy, this doesn't work this way. The only magnitude that you influence is I, investment. And you do it in this way here. I. Investment increasing, then if the three remaining components remain stable, you increase the investment. So GDP or aggregate demand will increase, the demand curve will shift. So that's the third market for goods and services, how you get from here to there. remember, the Q or real GDP on the horizontal axis, consumer price index on the vertical axis. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis. Imagine that you have original demand curve 1. Imagine then that you did this increase the money supply that led to a drop in interest rate, that led to an increase in investment, that led to an increase in aggregate demand. That's shown in this model as a sheet of the aggregate demand curve. Right. But the supply curve here, according to Keynesian, is horizontal during the recession. Just that's increased. That means that the CPI doesn't change whatever you do in monetary policy. I'll come back to this. I'll try to understand why they do this. The CPI is pretty much constant. So you go from this point to equilibrium number 1. Point 2, the real GDP will increase while prices remain stable. That's the final point. So, this is how it should look. Any questions last one? This is just a graphical representation of why the demand curve here in this relevant portion is horizontal, because it reflects the assumption of Keynesians that the price level will not change if you increase the money supply in a recession. It means that monetary policy is not inherently inflation. You don't have to worry for now about why is that the case. Come back to that later on, but just bear in mind that they assume that the prices should remain stable over the entire policy intervention. If it's a recession, situation, and increase the money supply, prices should not increase, only real productivity. Now, what can go wrong here? A couple of things. There are two crucial points, two critical junctures when transmission mechanism may fail and something may go wrong. The first one is here. Actually, your change in money supply may not lead to a drop in interest rate. That's number one. And then number two is on the next step here. Even if the interest rate drops, the investment may not increase. Okay, so the first type of situation is called the Keynesian lingo liquidity trap. And it is based on something called liquidity preference. Liquidity preference is a situation when people run to cash. People liquidate their long-term assets and loans, and they run as fast as possible to the most short-term forms of wealth that they can find, typically cash. But they also move from long-term bonds to very short-term bonds. That's a typical occurrence at the beginning of any recession. That's a liquidity trap, and I'll explain in a moment how liquidity trap leads to this strange phenomenon that you increase the money supply, but the interest rate remains very close. And the number two is called the situation when you have a certain drop in the interest rate, but the investment doesn't increase. It's called interest rate insensitivity. investing, insensitivity of investing. What changes in interest rate? Interest rate insensitivity of investment. It means it doesn't react to a given change in interest rate. Investment is what it is, whatever happens. So either one of these two or both of them very often can happen. And if either one of them happens, it greatly reduces the efficiency of monetary policy. So now, what are the reasons to believe that something like this could happen? Give you some examples. Whether this run to cash is a real phenomenon. So we know when people panic or when people feel uncertain about the future, they do certain things to reduce the perceived level of risk. If people face financial insecurity, what they typically do, they increase their savings, they increase their cash balances, they increase the buffer between themselves and any unpredicted economic exigence or any unpredictable adverse economic event. So that means that typically the demand for money will greatly increase, demand to hold cash balances will increase during the recession. And the demand for loans, the demand for money as a means of supplying loans at the future date will be reduced. We already discussed this. I gave you the basic gist of the idea when I invoked this Keynesian story about that you can take a horse by the river, but you cannot force it to drink water. At the same token, you can increase the money supply in a situation of recession, but it will work as an instrument of monetary policy only if you can accept people to spend the money or to save it and invest. If you create more money and people just keep it in their cash balances, you're not solving any problem. That's exactly what happens. The liquidity trap is the situation in which you give new money to the people, they don't spend it. Essentially, you have something like this. This is the demand curve for money. Let's say you're here. This is the interest rate. You increase the interest rate right now, so the demand for money is so elastic. Here, interest rate doesn't change. You see, this is the money supply curve. You increase the money supply curve. Number two, you increase the quantity of money in the system, of course, but you haven't decreased the interest rate at all. Why haven't you decreased the interest rate? So you see, all new money was just transferred to cash balances. So in order for an increase in money supply to lead to a drop in the interest rate, the credit market for loanable funds has to be active. Supply of credit has to increase. This is one of the graphs that you don't have that can help you visualize what I'm talking about here and what the textbook is talking about. You have the demand for commercial loans. Normal demand group, you have a supply. If you want the interest rate to drop, something has to happen. The most usual, the most common thing that will happen is that the supply will increase. This will be shown as a drift shift of the supply curve, right? So you go from this equilibrium position here, interest rate 1, quantity 1, this one. Your quantity increases and interest rate drops. So it's typically expect for monetary policy to have this result. This is a loan market or credit market. Market for loanable funds, call it whatever you want. We already analyzed this. So the precondition of all of this entire sequence happening is that this happens on the credit market. That an increase in the total supply of money results in new credit creation, new funds being created. But if people are so stingy and afraid, and all the money that they get simply ends up in cash balances, and none of it or very little of it ends up in savings accounts, where it could be used to create new credit, then nothing will change. There will be no expansionary effect of monetary policy if people just hoard. This is the term, hoarding cash. People hoard cash. This preference for hoarding is so strong that very little of this additional money will end up on the credit market. And we have a pretty good empirical, both theoretical and empirical evidence that something like this is real. That this shift from long-term assets, long-term investment to short-term investment always accompanies recession. The simplest proof that this is the case is something called yield curve. It tells you that the liquidity trap is just one example of a broader phenomenon. So you know what is a yield curve? I might have mentioned this. So you have here the interest rate, usually the bond money. You have maturity of time down here. So you have 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, 2 years, 4 years bonds maturity of a bond. And here you have an array of interest rates or yields, bond yields. So yield curve looks something like this, a normal yield curve. This is a normal yield curve. Which is the longer the maturity of a bond, higher the interest rate, higher the yield. And it flattens a little bit towards the end. It's different between 10 years and 20 years is percentual less than between 6 months and 1 year. But it's an increment in yield with every period of maturity increase. And now something very weird happens before the recession. We'll come back to this, but this weird phenomenon with yield curve is one of the first signs of a recession, always. Before unemployment increases, because before profit rates start going down, before any other of the macroeconomic criteria or macroeconomic measures show a recession, you will find a yield curve inversion or flattening of the yield curve, which means the equalization of yields across maturities. Sometimes even the short-term bonds have a higher yield. You can have something like this severe recession. 1 month bonds or 3 months bonds have a higher yield than 3 years bonds. Why is that? Because people run to cash. People are afraid what my 3-year bond is worth if I don't know what's going to happen in 3 years. Severe recession. So people are selling the long-term assets en masse and buying short-term assets. That's essentially the same phenomenon. That's the same reason for which people want to hold more cash. Cash is an ideal liquid asset, but also a 1-month bond is better than 1-year bond if there is an economic uncertainty associated with the recession. So, if this happens, then Keynesians say monetary policy may not work because the interest rates, especially the interest rates on long-term investment, they may not drop. They may even increase. See, there's a flattening over there. Usually talk about the flattening, this relative equalization of rates. Sometimes it could be complete inversion of the yield curve. And there is no economic recovery if there is no confidence in the business community that the long-term investment will pay off. Long-term investments has to start picking up steam before the economy enters the recovery phase. If there is this phenomenon of liquidity trap, or that people hold on to their cash and their short-term assets, you can forget about recovery. Whatever you do with monetary policy. The interest rates will not budge, the interest rates will not go down. Until you do something to convince people that it's gonna be okay. Now Keynesians believe that this is you need fiscal policy to do that, but monetary policy may not. So that's the first reason. That's the first stumbling block for the efficiency of monetary policy. The interest rate may not go down because of the strong preference for liquid assets that reduce or bring almost to zero the amount of money newly created by the government that will be really invested rather than kept in cash balances and very short-term assets. Now, but let's assume, so is this okay? You with me with this? Okay, deep breath. Any questions? Okay. The next problem is, let's assume that interest rate really decrease. What can go wrong further here is that investment may not react in a proper fashion. And investment demand might be very low. This investment curve might look like this, irrespective of the interest rate, the quantity of funds that will be invested into the economy will be fixed. That's called the interest rate insensitivity of investment. And it's again the same or similar phenomenon. You can bet when there is a liquidity preference problem, liquidity trap, that you will have also interest rates insensitivity. Because those are the same people, consumers, savers, and investors, the same people. The same, if the sentiment is very bad among consumers and among savers, it will be very bad among investors as well. If ordinary people want to hold more cash in their cash balances, investors will hold on, and the banks will keep excess reserves. You can pour all money that you want to, because they're not going to create new credits. Institutional investors behave in exactly the same fashion. By the way, that's something that happened in recent past in America. In 2009, 2010, the Federal Reserve System created a gigantic, humongous amount of money. It was known as the program of quantitative easing, which was the program of purchasing a huge amount of long-term government bonds. They amassed trillions of dollars on their balance sheet. And a huge amount of cash ended up in bank reserves, but they were not creating new credit, as the money multiplier was very low. Why was that? Because the banks and financial investors didn't believe that economic conditions were good enough in order for them to feel safe, to feel confident that they can lend that money. Economic conditions were not good enough that they believe that they can increase substantially credit creation. They didn't believe that the economy will be good enough to allow all those loans to be paid back. So for a variety of reasons. Why was that the case? For quite a few years, from 2009 until 2014, 15, essentially, was the witness of this systematic uncertainty in the banking system. Banks were sitting on huge cash reserves, excess reserves. They didn't have to keep those reserves. According to law, they could lend them out, but they decided not to do so. Why? Because uncertainty was such that it doesn't matter what the interest rate is. I'm not going to lend you money if I don't believe that you're going to pay. It doesn't make me feel any better that the interest rate is 0 or 1% if I don't believe that you're going to pay back the loan. If I don't believe that you're going to pay back the loan, who cares about the interest rate? So that's another problem. If uncertainty is strong enough, then even if the interest rates, market interest rates, go to 0 or close to 0, there will be no increase meaningful increase in investment because the new credit will not be created because the banks will feel uncomfortable creating new loans. So that's the second chain, the second link where things can go wrong. And now you see in a bit more detail why Keynesians are skeptical about efficiency of monetary policy. Because they believe that the transmission mechanism from changes in money supply to eventually having production increased is very long, indirect, and coupled with many systematic risks and uncertainties. And it's very likely one or both of these things are very likely to happen in a recession. So you can say that how long the link of transmission from changes in money supply to increased production will depend how effective you think monetary policy is. If your explanation of how monetary policy works involves a longer transmission mechanism, you tend to be more skeptical. You'll see next time on Wednesday when we discuss monetarists and their view of monetary policy, they have a very simple, straightforward and short transmission link. Almost directly from changes in money supply to aggregate demand. And it shouldn't shock you then that they believe that few things can go wrong with monetary policy because the link is so simple and straightforward. So it's the basic law of probability. You have when more than one independent thing has to fit together, the probability that the entire sequence will happen drops. That's more degrees of freedom, as mathematicians say. There are 2 or 3 places when something can go wrong. The likelihood of something going wrong increases. If there is only one thing, even if the probabilities here are equal, this be maybe 3%, but it's going to get much more when you add them up all together. If there is only one step, then the likelihood that something going wrong will be far lower. So that's a kind of deeper mathematical explanation of why Keynesians believe that monetary policy in general will not work. They still believe, get me wrong, they still believe that you should try and keep the interest rate as low as possible. That's what Lord Keynes, when you read his general theory, book that established Keynesian theory, he says, yes, you should try to keep the interest rate as low as possible for monetary policy, but the problem is that that's usually not enough. It's usually not enough. Okay, and I think that's all I've got for today. Do you have any additional questions?
Which theory do you like more?
Which theory do I like more? I don't know. That's a good question. I'll try to answer in 1 or 2 minutes. In general terms, I think that monetarists have a more realistic appreciation of how government works, a more realistic appreciation of the entire process of monetary and fiscal policies. However, that being said, when it comes to this particular case, I think that Keynesians have. I think that monetary policy is not. That doesn't mean, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that the Keynesian solution is the correct one, fiscal policy. I'm not claiming that. I'm just saying that this thing with monetary policy doesn't seem to be as simple and efficient as monetarists. And we will see why is that when we include other schools of thought, such as neoclassical or Austrian, but additional arguments why maybe Keynesians are right in the diagnosis of the problem, but their solution might be even worse than the problem. That's also possible. You see, Keynesians are better here in diagnosing the problem, but it very well might be that their solution for the problem is even worse. Oh, that is not 1 minute.
Nice to see you. Yeah.